In Episode 4, titled Scope, ROE, and Staying Legal, we're going to treat boundaries the way seasoned testers do, as safety rails that keep the work professional, defensible, and useful, instead of risky and chaotic.
Pen Test Plus questions often hide the real test inside the boundary details because it's easy to pick a technically effective action that is wrong simply because it violates scope, timing, or authorization. The good news is that boundaries are not abstract or academic. They are concrete decision filters you can apply in seconds once you know what to look for. When you practice applying them early and consistently, the exam stops feeling like a guessing game and starts feeling like a structured judgment test. The goal for this episode is to give you a repeatable boundary check routine you can run before you commit to an answer choice.
Scope is the first and most visible boundary, and it is made up of several elements that the exam expects you to read with precision. Scope includes the targets that are explicitly in, the systems that are explicitly out, the objectives that define what you are trying to prove, and the constraints that limit how you can operate. Targets included might be specific hosts, applications, networks, or environments, and exclusions are just as important because they remove options even when they look close enough. Objectives matter because they define what success looks like, such as validating a control weakness, assessing exposure, or demonstrating impact within a limited area. Constraints tie scope to reality, including safety requirements, allowed methods, or restrictions based on operational sensitivity. When you read a prompt, practice mentally separating these elements because they often appear scattered across the story rather than in one neat sentence. Rules of engagement, often shortened to ROE, translate scope into approved behavior, and that's why they show up in so many exam questions. ROE defines what methods are approved, when you are allowed to perform them, and how you should escalate when you encounter something unexpected. Approved methods can include what types of testing are permitted, what level of disruption is acceptable, and what actions are explicitly prohibited, even if they might work. Timing matters because an action can be acceptable in principle but unacceptable during a specific window, such as business hours or a change freeze. Escalation steps matter because the exam wants you to behave like a professional who communicates and coordinates, not like a solo operator improvising in a fragile environment. When you see ROE cues in a prompt, treat them as the rules of motion for the scenario and filter answers by whether they comply. Authorization evidence is the proof behind all of this, and the exam treats it as a hard prerequisite because authorization is what separates testing from wrongdoing. Authorization evidence is whatever demonstrates that you have permission to perform the assessment within defined limits, and the key point is that it must be clear enough to defend later. This matters because a penetration test is not only a technical activity, it is also a legal and ethical one, and your actions must be traceable to an approved purpose. In questions, authorization evidence is often implied by a statement that you are engaged by a client, but sometimes it is missing or ambiguous, and that ambiguity is the test. If the prompt does not establish permission, answers that assume invasive action are often wrong because they skip the fundamental requirement of being allowed to do the work. Treat authorization as the foundation under the entire timeline, because without it, everything else is a liability. Scope traps are common because they mirror real-world temptation. The most interesting systems are often the ones you are not allowed to touch. In exam prompts, these traps frequently appear as nearby systems, adjacent subnets, related applications, or shared infrastructure that seems relevant but is explicitly excluded. The wrong answer is often the one that argues implicitly or explicitly that the exclusion is inconvenient and can be ignored for efficiency. The correct answer is the one that respects the exclusion and finds a compliant path forward, even if that path feels slower. This is not about being timid.
It is about being trustworthy and defensible, because a tester who violates scope damages the credibility of the entire engagement. When you see a tempting, excluded system, treat it like a red line and look for answers that either avoid it or escalate for clarification, rather than crossing it. Time windows and change freezes are another boundary layer that can completely alter what best means, even when the technical goal stays the same. A time window might restrict when active testing can occur, or it might require you to prioritize actions that produce evidence efficiently within a short duration. A change freeze implies a heightened sensitivity to disruption, where even normally acceptable actions could create operational risk or create confusion during controlled periods. On the exam, timing constraints often appear as short phrases like during business hours, maintenance window, or change freeze, and they are easy to overlook if you are focused on the technical details. The right answer often shifts toward low-impact validation, careful observation, or postponing certain actions until the appropriate window. If you ignore timing constraints, you will often pick an answer that is technically correct but contextually unacceptable, which is exactly the kind of professional judgment the exam is measuring.
Stop conditions are the boundary rules for when you pause or halt activity, and they tend to show up in questions that test maturity under uncertainty. Stop conditions can be triggered by instability, such as a system behaving unpredictably, performance degrading, or signs that an action could cause unintended harm. They can also be triggered by sensitive exposure, where you encounter data or access that exceeds what was expected, and you need to limit harm and escalate appropriately. Safety risk is a direct stop condition, because the moment safety is in doubt, the workflow shifts from continue testing to reduce risk and communicate. A client request is also a stop condition because authorization is contingent and can be narrowed or paused at any time. On the exam, the best answers in stop condition scenarios often emphasize restraint and communication rather than pressing forward, because professionalism is demonstrated by knowing when not to act. Communication paths are part of staying legal and professional because they define who you notify, when you notify them, and what level of detail you provide. In a controlled engagement, you do not improvise communication. You use the agreed escalation and notification routes, which is what separates a coordinated test from uncoordinated disruption. Questions may describe an unexpected discovery, a suspected high-risk issue, or an event that could impact operations, and the correct answer often includes notifying the right person through the right channel. Timing matters here as well, because immediate notification may be required for certain findings, while routine updates might follow a scheduled cadence. Detail matters because you need enough information to support a decision, but not so much that you leak sensitive data or create unnecessary confusion. A clear communication path keeps the work aligned with client expectations and keeps you operating under permission rather than assumption. Data handling expectations are another boundary category that can be subtle in exam prompts but decisive in answer choices. Professional testing collects the minimum evidence needed to prove a finding and supports reporting, and then protects that evidence as confidential information. Minimum evidence matters because excessive collection increases risk, increases exposure, and can violate client expectations even when the intention is good. Protecting confidentiality matters because the assessment itself can become a source of harm if sensitive data is mishandled, shared too widely, or stored carelessly. On Pen Test Plus style questions, the best answers often show restraint in what is collected and care in how it is treated, especially when prompts mention sensitive environments or regulated data. If an option implies broad collection just in case, it may be technically possible, but professionally weak, because it does not align with minimizing harm and respecting confidentiality.
Documentation habits are the boundary system's supporting structure, because documentation is what allows your actions to be defended and your findings to be trusted later.
Documentation means recording what you did, why you did it, what you observed, and how those observations tie to objectives and constraints.
The exam likes to test documentation indirectly by offering answers that focus only on the technical action while ignoring the need to record intent and results, especially when something unexpected occurs.
Good documentation is also how you avoid ambiguity when reporting, because it turns memory into evidence and reduces the chance of overstating impact.
It supports repeatability, which is a hallmark of defensible testing, and it also supports internal accountability, because it shows that actions followed the agreed rules. When you select answers that include clear recording of actions and intent, you are aligning with the professional model the exam expects.
Now, imagine a scenario where boundaries conflict with curiosity, because that is where scope and legality become most real. You discover a system that appears to be highly vulnerable and obviously interesting, but the prompt indicates it is explicitly excluded from scope, or it resides in an environment where the rules prohibit the methods you would need to test it safely. The curious part of your brain will argue that it is close enough or important enough to touch, and exam answer choices often mirror that temptation. The compliant choice is to resist the impulse and follow the agreed boundaries, which may mean stopping, documenting what you observed at a high level, and notifying the appropriate contact through the established path. This is not a loss. It is a professional win, because it preserves the integrity of the engagement and protects the client from unauthorized risk. In exam terms, the correct answer is usually the one that respects scope and escalates appropriately, rather than acting first and explaining later.
Pivoting safely is how you keep momentum without crossing lines, and it's a skill the exam rewards because it reflects real engagement discipline. If a target is excluded or too risky under current constraints, a safe pivot means selecting alternate targets that remain authorized and still support the objective. This might involve focusing on systems explicitly in scope, using lower impact approaches within the allowed methods, or shifting to validation steps that build evidence without triggering stop conditions. Safe pivoting also means reevaluating what the prompt has established about permission and timing, because an action can be acceptable later, even if it is not acceptable now. The key is to treat boundaries as design parameters, not as annoyances, and to choose a path that still produces useful outcomes within those parameters. On the exam, pivot answers often sound less dramatic than the big exploit option, but they are usually the ones that demonstrate judgment, restraint, and professionalism. A memory anchor helps you run a boundary check quickly, and a good one here is scope, rules, evidence, communication, documentation. Scope reminds you to confirm what is in and out, what the objective is, and what constraints apply. Rules remind you that ROE defines approved methods, timing, and escalation, and that best means best within the rules. Evidence reminds you to confirm that permission exists and that your actions are defensible, not assumed. Communication reminds you to use the right notification paths when surprises, risks, or stop conditions appear. Documentation reminds you to record actions and intent so reporting is accurate, credible, and aligned with what was authorized. If you can run those 5 words through your head before committing to an answer, you will avoid many of the most common exam pitfalls.
In this episode, the core message is that staying legal and professional is not a separate task from technical skill. It is the framework that makes technical skill safe, valuable, and defensible. Boundaries begin with scope and are OE, which define targets, exclusions, objectives, constraints, approved methods, timing, and escalation steps. Authorization evidence matters because it is the foundation of permission, and the exam will often test whether you notice when it is missing or unclear. Time windows, stop conditions, communication paths, data handling expectations, and documentation habits all shape what the best next action looks like, even when the vulnerability or opportunity seems obvious. Before your next task or practice question, rehearse the boundary checks: scope, rules, evidence, communication, documentation, so the correct answer becomes the one that fits professional reality, not just technical possibility. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.